In August of 2013, the mayor of New York City and officials from the NYPD announced what at the time was described as the largest gun bust in the city's history. Following a months-long undercover operation, law enforcement retrieved 254 firearms, a number of which had been reported stolen, and arrested 19 people. The investigation and consequent 552-count indictment was sparked by the social media activity of local rapper Matthew "Neno" Best, who was named in the conference announcing the bust. Best had bragged online about selling guns out of his Ocean Hill recording studio and frequently posted photos with firearms and wads of cash. He was wiretapped by the NYPD, and investigators traced the operation back to two men in the Carolinas who smuggled guns separately but used the same middlemen in NYC. Walter Walker and Earl Campbell sourced the weapons from suppliers in their hometowns of Sanford, North Carolina and Rock Hill, South Carolina. They used cheap Chinatown buses to smuggle them into New York City, where the man at the center of distribution was Best's friend, Omol Adeji. The rapper was only charged with conspiracy, but his decision to flaunt his illicit lifestyle had basically brought down the entire operation and resulted in serious charges for its leading figures. Number 8. El Chino Anthrax. Jose Rodrigo Arechiga Gamboa, also known as El Chino Anthrax or Scarface Reborn, was at one point one of the most feared men in South America. He was the co-founder of Los Anthrax, the leading enforcer unit of the notorious Sinaloa cartel, and provided armed services for its leader, drug lord Ismael El Mayo Zambada. In spite of being a wanted man with a $15 million reward for his capture, the latter has never been arrested or incarcerated. Gamboa's squad of assassins was connected to a series of gruesome killings carried out on the cartel's behalf. It included the murder of 3 men who were hung from a bridge in 2011 in retaliation for a senior cartel member who'd been killed. Gamboa was also suspected of masterminding the killing of Francisco Rafael Arellano Felix, the leader of the Tijuana cartel. He was gunned down by a man disguised as a clown while celebrating his birthday in Baja California Sur in October of 2013. Around the same time, Gamboa was wanted by the US government for importing methamphetamine and cocaine into California. He nevertheless continued to flaunt his lavish lifestyle on social media. Some of the images showed gold-plated firearms, him holding an assault rifle out of a Lamborghini window, attending extravagant parties, or even meeting celebrities, such as Paris Hilton. The Los Anthrax leader became the subject of narco folk songs who described him as an elegant and fit man with a taste for yachts, champagne, and luxury cars. Gamboa's boasting would eventually translate to him snitching on himself and thus lead to his downfall. Even though he'd blur his face on the photos he posted of himself, the authorities were still able to track his movements through the posts. On December the 31st of 2013, he was arrested by Dutch police as he arrived in Amsterdam while traveling under a fake name. The 33-year-old had altered his appearance and fingertips, but advanced forensics confirmed his identity. He was extradited to the US and in 2015 admitted drug charges as well as facilitating violence for the Sinaloa cartel. After serving several years in a federal penitentiary, Gamboa was released and placed on house arrest in March of 2020. On May the 9th of that year, he was reported missing. Less than a week later, he was found dead in Ayun, Sinaloa, in a black SUV along with his sister and her husband. Number 7. Raymond Michael Weber. On January the 30th of 2021, law enforcement in California were alerted to a horrific Instagram live stream shared by a man in Solano County. He was identified as 29-year-old Raymond Michael Weber, who recorded himself holding a gun with the bodies of 2 females lying on the floor of a Vacaville apartment. Officers from the local police department made their way to the Rocky Hill Apartments, a military housing complex, but Weber refused to surrender and barricaded himself in the apartment. An 8-hour standoff ensued, during which negotiators and SWAT teams were called to the scene. Weber was named as the older brother of local rapper Marcus Weber, who performed as Uzi Marcus. He was also reported to have served in the army but was not an active duty soldier at the time of the incident and not connected to the nearby Travis Air Force Base. The standoff ended after a brief struggle in which law enforcement subdued Weber using a taser. The lifeless females found inside the apartment were his fiancée, 26-year-old Savannah Theberg, and an unnamed Elk Grove teenager. The police investigated human trafficking as a possible factor leading up to the double homicide. Weber faced multiple charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder. In 2014, he'd been linked to the fatal shooting of his then-girlfriend, 19-year-old Nicole Duarte. While it was suspected that he'd been present during the killing, his younger brother, Antoine, eventually pleaded no contest to the murder. Number 6. Eric Edwards. In early August of 2008, Eric Edwards was brought in for questioning by law enforcement in Dallas, Texas, in connection to the shooting death of Mikhail Hudson, which had occurred in late July of that same year. The suspect and an accomplice were believed to have followed the victim in another vehicle and fatally opened fire on him. Dallas homicide detective Rick Duggan started interrogating Edwards, and their interaction was caught on a video that would later become viral and featured on an episode of After the First 48. In his initial version of events, the suspect claimed that his accomplice, who'd been driving the vehicle, had fired the fatal shots. He then changed his story to say that he'd actually been the one driving while his partner was the gunman. Duggan told Edwards that neither version of events was supported by the evidence. The detective then changed the tone of the conversation by talking about the victim and the tragedy of his passing. Edwards, seemingly forgetting he was in an interrogation room, revealed that he knew Hudson and that his brother had passed away 6 months prior. He then told Duggan, "His brother Marcus and the one I shot is named Mike." The detective immediately pointed out that Edwards had just said, "The one I shot?" The suspect tried to backtrack on the inadvertent confession, but he was arrested for murder. Number 5. Amber Campbell and John ARWOOD. In late December of 2014, Florida couple Amber Campbell and John ARWOOD trespassed at the Marine and Environmental Science Center of the Daytona State College. Their intentions were unclear, but the escapade had resulted in them being chased and eventually taking refuge in a custodian's closet. The facility was closed for the holiday, so ARWOOD and Campbell, aged 31 and 25, respectively, remained in the closet. After about 2 days, ARWOOD called the police to ask for help, reporting that they were trapped. Law enforcement tracked his cell phone and reached the couple, expecting to free them from their ordeal. They found ARWOOD and Campbell surrounded by human feces, as well as copper scouring pads used for smoking methamphetamine and crack cocaine. Law enforcement smelled meth inside the closet and suspected that the couple's mind state during the incident had been influenced by drug consumption. It was regarded as the only reasonable explanation for why they'd waited for so long to call 911 and why they'd never checked the door. They were never trapped in the closet, as it had been left unlocked, and they could have simply walked out at any moment. They were arrested for trespassing. ARWOOD had been jailed 5 times in the past for offenses that included drug possession and burglary. Campbell had escaped from a mental health facility in late April of 2013, but was recaptured after crashing her brother's car. Once in custody, she tricked officers into loosening her handcuffs and lowering the cruiser's windows by claiming that she couldn't breathe. Campbell escaped and fled into nearby woods. She punched a deputy who chased her down, but was ultimately subdued with a stun gun. For the escape and assault, Campbell was given 3 years probation, which she violated through the closet incident. Number 4. Maxi Sopo. Cameroon man Maxi Sopo arrived in the US in 2003 and initially made a living by selling roses in Seattle nightclubs. By early 2009, he'd masterminded a fraud scheme that involved persuading young co-conspirators to lie about their income and get loans for imaginary cars. Sopo targeted several banks and credit unions in the Seattle area, obtaining over $200,000. When federal authorities started investigating him, he drove a rented car to Mexico in February of 2009 and disappeared. Law enforcement initially had a hard time tracking him down, but a few months later, Sopo updated his Facebook status. His profile photo showed him partying in front of a backdrop featuring logos of BMW and Courvoisier Cognac, while wearing a black jacket emblazoned with a white lion. Sopo's Facebook profile was set to private, but his list of friends wasn't. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Scoville combed through it and found that one of the man's friends was a former Department of Justice official. Scoville sent a message requesting a phone call. The former official accepted and reported to have met Sopo a few times in Cancun nightclubs, unaware that he was a fugitive. After finding out exactly where the fraudster was living, the former official shared the information with Scoville, who in turn alerted Mexican law enforcement. In October of 2009, Sopo was arrested and prepared for extradition to the US, where he faced up to 30 years in prison. It would later be revealed that while on the run, he'd been living in an upscale apartment complex while working at a hotel. He'd been posting on Facebook about living in paradise, partying in nightclubs, and lounging on the beach. Number 3. Rodney Knight. Washington, D.C. man Rodney Knight broke into the home of Washington Post reporter Mark Fisher in December of 2010. The invasion took place during the day when the house was empty, and Fisher would later blog about it and the impact it had had on his family. 19-year-old Knight stole the reporter's new winter jacket, but most of what he took actually belonged to the man's 15-year-old son. It included his laptop, iPod, savings bonds, and cash. What Knight did next, however, would result in a DC area detective describing him as the most stupid criminal he'd ever seen. He used the teen's laptop to take a photo of himself while wearing Fisher's winter jacket and holding the stolen cash. Knight then went on the teen's Facebook account and posted the photo, which clearly showed his face. Fisher wrote in the column that his son had coped well with the burglary until seeing the taunting image online, adding, "That's when the pathetic indignity of the burglary hit." A few weeks after the incident, on January the 2nd of 2011, Knight was arrested by local law enforcement after a foot chase. He was found to be in possession of an unlicensed pistol that was loaded with one round in the chamber and another in the magazine. He eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree burglary and carrying a pistol without a license, for which he was jailed for 27 and 17 months, respectively. Number 2. Tyrell Jones. In 2014, the FBI and DEA teamed up and launched an operation aimed at arresting drug traffickers, primarily based on researching their social media for photos in which they'd flaunted their activities. The practice was so widespread that over the course of a single weekend in the spring of that year, the agencies arrested over 350 dealers following sting operations throughout the US. They also recovered over $2 million in cash, hundreds of pounds of marijuana, and at least 50 pounds of cocaine. The total street value of the haul was estimated at $7 million. One of the arrested dealers, Minneapolis man Tyrell Jones, posted a photo of the warehouse where he kept his drugs and bragged about moving weight. In doing so, he unknowingly geotagged the location and basically gave up the location of his stash. Law enforcement tracked down the warehouse, found Jones inside, and arrested him without incident. Number 1. Martin Bryant. On April the 28th of 1996, Australian man Martin Bryant carried out the deadliest mass shooting in the country's history. After gunning down bed and breakfast owners David and Noeline Martin, the 28-year-old headed to the Port Arthur historic site, a popular tourist destination in Tasmania's Port Arthur. Bryant rapidly moved through a cafe and nearby gift shop, indiscriminately killing 20 people with a Colt AR-15 semi-automatic rifle. He continued firing as he fled in his yellow Volvo 244, claiming further victims. His spree progressed to theft of a golden BMW and the killing of its 4 occupants, as well as taking a motorist hostage. Bryant returned to the bed and breakfast where he was cornered by the police. Officers tried negotiating with him, but he ultimately killed his hostage, set the building ablaze, and tried to escape in the confusion. Bryant was captured after suffering heavy burns to his back and buttocks. His spree, counted among the deadliest in history, left 35 people dead and 23 injured, leading to tighter gun laws in Australia. Bryant's motivation was mainly attributed to his desire for attention, as well as his anger towards the Martins, who'd refused to sell the B&B to his father. The man later took his own life, contributing to Bryant's mental unrest. Years after the mass shooting, a disturbing and previously unseen video surfaced of one of Bryant's early police interviews. He seemingly reveled in the destruction he'd caused as he was smiling and continually asking detectives about how many people had been killed and injured. Bryant, whose reported IQ of 66 was well below average, baited the police with a confession before snitching on himself while mistakenly believing that the cameras had been turned off. He told officers that he hoped the culprit would be caught before pointing to himself and mouthing the word "me." Bryant then told detectives that they should have put that on recording and seemed shocked upon being informed that he was still being filmed. By then, however, the evidence against him was insurmountable. He was given 35 life sentences with an added 1,652 years, all without the possibility of parole. In case you haven't quite satiated your they will kill you cravings just yet, then we have our previous release on When Testifying Goes Wrong lined up next for you. Number 7. Charlie Lewis. On June the 7th of 2020, 32-year-old Charlie Lewis was found dead in an alley in Denver, Colorado. She had been shot to death and her body was discovered at 5 a.m. by a cyclist. Days earlier, on June the 1st, a homicide had taken place in nearby Aurora. On that day, at around 12 p.m., a gunshot was reported and a 41-year-old man was found in serious condition. His name was John Cyprian, and he later succumbed to his gunshot wound in the hospital. A man named Stephen Young was a suspect in the homicide case. According to an Aurora detective, at one point during the night of the homicide, Charlie had been in a car with Stephen, as they were reportedly dating at the time. She had been the sole witness to the homicide. Aurora police put out a call for Charlie, believing her life to be in danger. Unfortunately, investigators suspect that Stephen got to her first. CCTV footage from June the 7th showed him and Charlie walking together shortly before the gunshot was reported. Stephen was then seen leaving the alley without Charlie. He was sentenced to life in prison, having been found guilty of John Cyprian's murder as well as the murder of Charlie Lewis. Number 6. Patrick Frazee. Patrick Frazee, a former investment banker, was accused of killing his fiancée, Kelsey Bereth. In 2018, Kelsey had last been seen shopping with their daughter in a Safeway store. Patrick reportedly killed Kelsey with a baseball bat whilst their infant daughter played in another room. After the killing, Patrick recruited the help of his then-girlfriend, Crystal Lee, to clean up the scene. Crystal had been called multiple times by Patrick as he previously wanted her to take part in the killing itself. Patrick then allegedly burned Kelsey's body on his property. Crystal's involvement made her a key witness in the case. Patrick was arrested on suspicion of the murder and taken to county jail. Whilst awaiting trial, he met another inmate housed nearby. The inmate had tattoos affiliated with a prison gang, and Patrick showed great interest in them. Patrick eventually asked the inmate if he could use his connections to eliminate witnesses in his case. In exchange, Patrick said he would financially look after the inmate after his release. On paper napkins, which he passed to the inmate, Patrick wrote the names of the witnesses in the case and where they could be found. He asked that Crystal, her ex-husband, and her parents be made to disappear. Patrick then asked the inmate that he flush the napkins down the toilet after the information had been passed on. The would-be conspirator, however, was not willing to get involved. Instead of fulfilling Patrick's requests, he kept the notes and presented them to investigators. The inmate was questioned in court on why he'd come forward with evidence against Patrick. He replied that he felt it was the right thing to do and that he was hoping to have his sentence lightened. Crystal Lee, amongst the others on Patrick's hit list, had narrowly escaped avoiding a grisly death. She was nevertheless sentenced to 3 years in prison for helping Patrick and tampering with evidence at the scene. Patrick was eventually convicted for murder, solicitation to commit murder, and tampering with a deceased human body. He was sentenced to life in prison plus an additional 156 years. Number 5. Joshua Brown. Joshua Brown was a witness who had testified against Amber Geiger, a female Dallas police officer accused of the murder of Botham Jean in 2018. Just 2 days after Geiger was sentenced to 10 years in prison for the murder, Brown was found dead, only a few miles from where Jean had been killed. Brown, Jean, and Geiger all shared an apartment complex. According to Geiger, she'd mistakenly accessed what she thought to be her apartment. Inside, she found Jean sitting in a darkened room eating ice cream, unarmed. Geiger testified that she believed John had broken into her apartment and she was afraid for her life when she drew her gun and fatally shot him. The apartment Geiger had entered was in fact Jean's apartment, 1 floor below Geiger's own. Immediately after the shooting, and presumably after realizing her alleged mistake, Geiger called 911. During Geiger's trial, Joshua Brown provided crucial evidence in the case. He stated that he'd heard what sounded like surprise between Geiger and Sean prior to hearing the gunshots. According to Brown, no police commands had been uttered such as "put your hands up." After the shooting, Brown fled the apartment complex. He later returned to find Geiger pacing the hallway, crying on the phone that she'd made a mistake. Brown also testified that previously he'd accessed the wrong floor of the complex himself by mistake, believing it to be his own. This became part of Geiger's defense. Brown was able to massively aid the investigation through his eyewitness account. So when he was found dead, shot in a parking lot, 2 days after Geiger's conviction, suspicions arose in the community. To date, however, there's no evidence that Brown's murder and Geiger's conviction are connected. Prior to the events, Brown had been caught up in a shooting at a club where he was shot in the foot and his friend had died. Brown reportedly knew the person who had shot him and was worried they might come back for him. His family stated that during the trial he was afraid of the publicity that it generated and that his cooperation with law enforcement might paint him as an informant and make him a target. An investigation revealed that at the time of his death, Brown may have been involved in a drug deal gone wrong. 3 men were later announced as suspects and indicted on capital murder charges. Number 4. Mario Nero. In the early 1990s, Mario Nero was walking his dog in Foggia, Italy, when he witnessed the aftermath of a murder. He saw a man dropping a gun and fleeing from a dead body which lay in a pool of blood. The dead body was that of Giovanni Panunzio, a businessman who had refused to pay protection money to the Italian mafia. Due to the fear of reprisals from the mafia, many who witnessed their activity do not report it to the authorities. Mario returned home and didn't say anything for 3 days. That was until Giovanni's son made an appearance on television, pleading for witnesses to come forward. Mario felt compelled to act. He went to the local police station and described what he had seen. He was able to identify the hitman through photographs provided to him by investigators. The hitman was named as Donato Delicari. Weeks later, police officers arrived at Mario's door to warn him and his family that they needed to leave and enter witness protection. They would be given a new house, a new identity, and financial support, but they wouldn't be able to contact their relatives or friends. Fearing for their lives, they agreed. They were moved to Tuscany, where they were housed in an apartment with no documents or identity. Being new to the local community and not having any identification documents caused great suspicion. Mario and his family were chastised. He was believed to be a pentito, which is the name given to former mafia gangsters who were placed into protection after cooperation with law enforcement. On one occasion, when his daughter was ill, Mario was stopped from entering the local hospital because of this rumor. Doctors would also not come to his house. After over a year, Mario and his family were finally provided a false name and given documents. They moved city 3 times, but the pentito rumor followed them. By 1997, the evidence provided by Mario had helped convict 46 mafia criminals. He was no longer deemed useful, so the government cut off his stipend and evicted him and his family. Mario enlisted the help of a magistrate and was eventually readmitted into the protection program with a doubled stipend. However, he remained angry at the government for uprooting his family's life and causing them years of difficulty and worry. Number 3. Maldonado Rodriguez. Maldonado Rodriguez was attacked in October of 2018 by 9 members of the MS-13 gang in Long Island, New York. He had intervened as the gang was threatening 2 teenagers. During the attack, he suffered multiple stab wounds and was hit in the head with a bat, but he survived. Because of his intervention, the gang members were arrested. Rodriguez was set to testify against them, but was brutally murdered before the trial. It was reported that the gang members in jail had ordered the killing, which was carried out by fellow MS-13 members who weren't incarcerated. The prosecution had allegedly obtained a protective order for Rodriguez's identity in December of 2018, but 1 year later, in December 2019, a judge's order had disclosed his identity, leaving him vulnerable. Number 2. Guy Coffey. Guy Coffey had been working as a police informant, tipping investigators off to crimes committed by a Baltimore street gang known as Train to Go. The gang was dangerous, mostly made up of drug dealers and guns for hire. At least 10 members of the gang were already in jail, awaiting trial. Guy Coffey's testimony was to be invaluable in putting them away. One of the gang members in jail was Taurus Tillman, also known as Tash. In a letter written to him by his defense attorney, Coffey's name was mentioned. This was because Coffey had directly named Tillman as having been responsible for a murder committed years earlier. With the gang aware of Coffey's identity, a $20,000 bounty was placed on his head. Tragically, he was hunted down within months and shot dead. Richard Bardos, Tillman's defense attorney, refused to comment on the letter mentioning Coffey's name. Number 1. Whitey Bulger. One of the most infamous gangsters in United States history, Whitey Bulger was the leader of Boston's feared Winter Hill Gang, responsible for nearly 20 killings between 1973 and 1985. He was finally brought to justice in 2013. In October of 2018, however, Bulger once again made the headlines after it emerged that he'd been killed inside a prison by fellow inmates. Bulger had just been transferred from a federal prison in Florida to the high-security U.S. penitentiary, Hazleton. Within hours, he was reported dead after he'd been severely beaten by more than one inmate. Witnesses close to the case say he was made unrecognizable. Over the years, Bulger had worked as an FBI informant, which may have led to him becoming a target. A mafia hitman, Fortios Freddy Geas, was a prime suspect in Bulger's killing. At the time of Bulger's death, Freddy was also incarcerated inside of USP Hazleton and reportedly hated informers as well as men who abused women. Whitey had done both. According to sources, Freddy has not disputed his involvement in the killing. Thanks for watching. Would you testify against someone you knew killed your friend? If it meant you may be endangered, let us know in the comments section below.